That's good. Well, good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to another lecture put on by the Center for the Study of Government and the Individual here at UCCS. CSGI exists to study the constitutional, economic, and political foundations of a free and flourishing society. And as part of this mission, we regularly host lectures just like this that address enduring questions of our constitutional order and contemporary problems in public policy. And I think that the lecture you're going to hear today very much covers both of these areas. Before introducing our speakers, I would like to thank two generous sponsors for this particular event. The first are Peter and Frida Wallison, and the second, the Institute for Humane Studies at George Mason University. I'd also like to thank more broadly the sponsors or those who support CSGI all year round as well. So we're fortunate today because we actually get a 2-for-1 special, which I hopefully doesn't make you guys feel cheap. But everybody's getting double the money for double the value of their free ticket today. The free ticket goes, of course, thanks to those sponsors. But we have two speakers instead of one, Hyrum and Hyrum Lewis. Yes, they are brothers. So what I'm guessing, if they're anything like my two sons, is that most of the lecture will be them arguing about whose turn it is to talk. But maybe we'll get some content in there as well. Hyrum Lewis, who is the older brother, by the way, even though some people think he looks younger, is a professor of history at BYU, Idaho, and has written and taught on early and modern U.S. history, as well as modern China. He's written books on American foundations and also a very, very brave book taking on recent atheists called There Is a God. So we welcome Hyrum. Hyrum Lewis is the Sterling Professor of Constitutional Studies at Utah Valley University, where he researches, teaches, and writes about the interaction of ideas and institutions in American politics. Now, if Hyrum looks familiar to anyone here, that is because he was a professor here at UCCS for 2 years. He left us a year ago. He made a mistake and he misses us terribly, but he has made it back. So on to their topic today. Well, normally I try to set the stage a little bit before a speaker entertains us, but their topic today is one that doesn't really require any of that from me. Right? Everyone in here has some notion, their own notion of the political spectrum that runs from left to right. And in their new book, The Myth of Left and Right, which was published by Oxford University Press this year, in 2023, they argue that whatever notion you have, it's probably wrong. So I will let them deliver that bad news to you in their own fashion. So please welcome me and joining, at this point, Hyrum Lewis.
Thank you, Professor Pitts, and thank you all for being here, and thank you to the Center for the Study of Government and the Individual for having us and sponsoring this event. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. We're here because we believe what we have to say in our book aligns with the mission of the Center. And you guys have noticed, and it's no secret, that our country is in a bad way right now. That authoritarianism is on the rise, freedom is on the decline, and that's a problem. And many people are eager to point fingers at the source of that problem. And they'll point to mediocre echo chambers, they'll point to racism, they will point to structural factors. But we believe that ideas have consequences. And one of the main reasons that our politics is broken is that we are using an incorrect conceptual model to understand politics. And so our book, The Myth of Left and Right, tries to expose the problems with our dominant paradigm. So that's what we're going to do today. And when we talk about the myth of left and right, what we're going to do is kind of break it down into 3 sub-myths. And that's going to kick things off here. And then I'll turn the time over to Hyrum to flesh out some of our ideas. Okay, so the first myth we want to talk about is the myth that there's only one issue in politics. Now you might be thinking to yourself, Professor Lewis, that's not right. Everybody knows there's many issues in politics. There's abortion, there's tax cuts, there's drug control, gun control, military interventions, a whole bunch of issues. Everybody knows that. You're attacking a straw man here. But you'll also notice that most people who say that will nonetheless use a unidimensional model in order to talk about politics. They'll talk about a spectrum. Now, if you think about it for a moment, that's oxymoronic, because a political spectrum can, by definition, only model one issue. So if there's more than one issue in politics, why are we talking about it as if there's just one that can be distributed on a spectrum left to right? I get it that there's more and less abortion, and there's more and less tax cuts, and there's more and less drug control, right? But one spectrum? That doesn't seem to make sense. So if you challenge people and say, why are you using a political spectrum if you agree that there's many, many issues? And they'll say, well, because these issues are connected. There's some connective tissue. Because see, people who believe in restricting abortion also tend to believe in tax cuts. Why is that? And they would say it's because there's one essential issue that underlies all the other issues. And therefore, a spectrum is accurate and useful because it can model where you stand on that one underlying issue. And many people have different ideas about what that one issue is, but the most common one is change. So if you're on the far left, you are really, really, really in favor of change. Progressive, you want to change things. If you're on the far right, you're a reactionary, you want to stop change. If you're a conservative, you kind of want to slow change down. So change is the one issue that binds all other issues, according to this way of looking at it. So there's one essence underneath everything else. Okay, now, we call this the essentialist theory of ideology. Essentialist because it says that there's an essence. There's some underlying philosophy or disposition or value or worldview that connects all other issues. So why is it that people who call themselves progressive agree on just about everything? They would say it's because they adhere to a progressive philosophy. That's the essence behind all of their positions. If I were to go to, let's just pick on the Democratic Party for a moment, we could pick on the Republicans just as easily, but if I were to go to any Democratic politician at almost any level of government, tap them on the shoulder, and I had a list of everything their party believed. Higher taxes on the wealthy, affirmative action for minorities, right to choose an abortion, on and on and on. And I said, which of these do you agree with? They would say, almost all of them would say, well, I agree with all of those. And I'd say, why? And they would say, because I'm a progressive. And those policies are expressions of my progressive philosophy. So essentialism is real. It's the dominant political model of our time. It is the dominant political myth of our time. Okay? It's a myth because even though almost everybody believes in it, there's no evidence for it. There's simply no evidence that there is an essence connecting all the positions. Yes, there is a correlation between believing in abortion rights and higher taxes on the wealthy, but that doesn't mean they're essentially connected. We'll tell you in a moment what does connect it. But if you ask for evidence for the essentialist theory, for somebody who is saying, I believe all those things are all connected, they would probably start to tell stories. But see, we don't believe the stories astrologers tell. And these stories have no more validity than astrological stories. All right, so let's move on to the second myth. The second myth is that ideology comes first. And by ideology, we mean narrowly left-right ideology. Conservative, liberal, progressive, left-wing, right-wing. That's what we mean by ideology here. Ideology narrowly conceived rather than broadly. And what we mean by ideology comes first is people think that you start with your worldview. You start with your principle. You start with your essence, okay, your philosophy, my progressive philosophy. And then once you have that philosophy, then you think yourself to all the different positions. So that Democratic politician who said, I'm a progressive, I have this progressive philosophy, and then I use that philosophy to say, I believe in abortion rights, because that's part of the progressive philosophy. Progressive philosophy expressed in the abortion debate is in favor of abortion rights. And I believe in higher taxes on the wealthy, because again, that is an expression of my philosophy. So you start with the ideology, think yourself to the policies, and then you join the tribe, the Democratic Party, because it shares your policies. So ideology first, position second, tribe third. The reality is that ideology comes last. That in fact, people start with the tribe. Once they have anchored into the tribe, and they anchor in for a lot of reasons, maybe family reasons, maybe there's one issue they really feel strongly about, maybe they just believe in a woman's right to choose is the most important thing, and so they anchor into the tribe for that reason, and then they adopt the other positions of that tribe as a matter of socialization, and then they cook up a story explaining how all these disparate issues somehow are progressive or advance social justice.
So ideology comes last. It's a story that we invent, ex post, to try to justify and mask our tribal attachments. Okay? The reality is, so that's the reality. The tribe comes first, not ideology. All right, so what do we do with that correlation then? That correlation that shows that people who are more likely to believe in abortion rights are also more likely to believe in higher taxes. The reason for that correlation is because of who, not what. It's not the underlying philosophy because there isn't one. It's because they belong to a tribe and the tribe believes it, and by watching the cable news of their tribe and going onto the Twitter feeds of their tribe and going to rallies of their tribe and associating with people who belong to their tribe in the faculty lounge or whatever it happens to be, then they pick up all the other positions. All right, now, our thesis is pretty radical. Some people say, well, isn't what you're saying obvious? Well, no, it's quite a radical thesis because we're saying nothing less than there is no such thing as conservatism or liberalism or progressivism. We're saying that those are myths, that they aren't real. And the people who say, I buy all these positions, I believe all these different things because I adhere to the philosophy of conservatism, we are saying that that's self-delusion. Okay? I believe all these things because they advance social justice. We believe those people are deluding themselves. And so we are trying to get people to stop deluding themselves. When that delusion goes, our politics can start to heal. All right. Now, the evidence for the social theory. We said that there's no evidence for the essentialist theory. There's none. There's stories, but those aren't evidence. Just like there's stories for astrology, but those aren't evidence. The evidence for the social theory of ideology is abundant. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of studies that back up that what we're saying is correct here, as counterintuitive as it might seem. So obviously, we started out by identifying the historical evidence. So what you see is people say, well, if you're a progressive, you believe in more government intervention in the economy because somebody who believes in social justice will believe that. Or if you're a liberal, but once upon a time, to be a liberal, the liberals believe in smaller. Oh, well, liberals, we're against wars. Wars are unjust. Social justice means we have to stop wars. In the 1940s, it was the opposite. Liberals said if you believe in social justice, you need to believe in going to war to spread peace in the world. Oh, well, liberals believe in free speech. Not really anymore. Okay? These things switch. 10 years ago, if you asked somebody, is it a conservative thing to believe that character is important in your public officials? The conservatives would have said overwhelmingly yes. Character in public officials matters a great deal, and I won't support a public official who doesn't have a good personal character because I'm a conservative and that's my philosophy. And then along came Donald Trump. And now, the number of conservatives who believe that public character matters has plummeted, and it's risen among the liberals. Isn't that interesting? So the idea that philosophy is driving beliefs is simply not true. Okay, the historical evidence makes that clear. If it was, we wouldn't see all of these flip-flops. You can also get people to change their views in a laboratory. So here we are saying, people called conservatives, the people who watch Fox News and stuff, they are bound by some underlying principle. That's why they believe what they do. If that was true, then why can we get them to change in the laboratory with priming? If you give a group of conservatives, self-identified conservatives, a piece of paper, and at the top it says, Donald Trump supports a higher minimum wage. Do you support a higher minimum wage? The number of conservatives who support it will be like 80%. If you give another group of conservatives a piece of paper that says Donald Trump opposes the minimum wage, then the number of conservatives who oppose it will be much, much lower, less than 50%. So it's pretty amazing how you can get people to switch based on social cues. Where is the philosophy driving their beliefs? It doesn't exist. Their beliefs come from their tribe. Okay? All right, now, you also have the survey data, which to me is the most convincing of all. Because if the essentialist theory was true, and opposition to abortion and belief in tax cuts went together naturally, we would see people holding those views independent of socialization. But we only find that correlation among people who have been socialized into the left-right way of thinking. The more you watch Fox News or MSNBC, the more you follow politics, the more your views are likely to align with what's considered left-wing right. But if you ask people who just think about these issues, or ask people from other countries who haven't been following American politics, there's no relationship whatsoever. Look no further than China. China's a communist country, left-wing, right? But they also have an anti-spiritual pollution campaign to censor pornography. That would be considered right-wing in America. So these things don't go together. You can look across time, you can look across space. There is no connection between the issues we consider left-wing and right-wing. They're bound contingently by social factors, not by philosophical or essential ones. All right, now let's move on to the last myth. So a lot of times we convince people, and they say, you're right, I agree. These aren't natural categories. They're socially constructed. But nonetheless, we need the political spectrum because it's useful. We need some kind of overarching model to help us understand politics. The reality is that the political spectrum is not useful at all. It is incredibly damaging, and the evidence for this is overwhelming. Delusions, by definition, are damaging. I want you to imagine that doctors today said, you know what? We're going to have a medical spectrum. And all illnesses and all treatments and all patients we're going to put somewhere on a line between red illnesses and blue illnesses. We would probably be really upset about that. And we would be upset because we'd say, well, there's obviously more than one illness. And if I went into the doctor and he said a fractured tibia and lung cancer are both, red illnesses, and I broke my leg and he gave me chemotherapy, we'd be kind of mad about that. Okay? Because we'd be confusing things. So instead of saying, you have a red illness, there's just two types, either red or blue, and you're somewhere along the spectrum, we would prefer the doctor to just tell us what we had. Drop the spectrum nonsense and just talk about it granularly. Just talk about my specific illness. Politics is just as complex as medicine. And yet here we are using a single line, this imaginary line, to talk about politics. It is kind of silly when you stop and think about it. So the same way that we wouldn't want a medical spectrum, we should all want to get rid of the political spectrum for the exact same reasons. And people who say, no, we need an overarching model. Does medicine have an overarching model? They don't, and they do just fine. You talk about infections, you talk about fractures, you talk about cancer, you talk about perforations, whatever it happens to be. You talk about it on a granular level. That works much better. All right. Now, so the claim that simplifies or brings order is simply not true. And then, of course, one of the pushbacks we get also is that they're saying, a lot of people will push us and they say, you're right. We need to get rid of the two-party system. That's not what we're saying. I, for one, happen to think the two-party system is a very good thing. It's probably the best way to organize our democracy. We're not against two parties. What we are against is the political spectrum and the delusion that all the positions of the party are philosophically connected. So here's a metaphor to help us understand how parties work. Currently, if you go to the grocery store, you go in and you just pick all your own groceries. Right? You go in, if you want some Swiss cheese, you grab that. If you want some Cheerios, you grab that. If you want some 1% milk, grab that. Get some yogurt, get some tortillas, whatever it happens to be. You just pick your own groceries. But what if you showed up to the grocery store one day and they were waiting out front with 2 baskets of groceries and said you have to pick one or the other? And each basket had a whole bunch of groceries. Now what you would do, and what would be rational, is for you to look at the baskets and say, you know what? I don't like everything in this basket, and I don't like everything in that basket. But I'm going to choose basket A because it has more of the things I like. That would be rational. That is how we should approach politics. When you vote, you should say, you know what? No party is perfect. And each party has things that are good and bad. But because of the nature of political parties, because of the way democracies work, we have to vote for bundles. We have to buy packages. We have to buy carts. That's how it works. That's rational. That's fine. It's fine to have parties. But here's what we're doing. To carry our metaphor on, here's what we do in politics, is instead of going to the grocery basket and saying, yeah, a bunch of stuff I like, don't like, we're saying, no. Everything in this basket is better than everything in that basket. And those Twinkies in that basket are awful and terrible, and how dare anybody eat those Twinkies and buy those Twinkies. And anybody who buys Twinkies is an awful person because they have the bad philosophy associated with that cart. Until the Twinkies get moved over to that cart. Suddenly we're defending them, right? Isn't that what we've done with character in public officials and has our policy switch? So what we're asking for is not an end to the two-party system. We're asking for an end to the delusion that there is philosophy behind the parties. People who are partisan don't admit they're being partisan. They're not saying, that Democrat politician I mentioned earlier who agrees with the Democratic Party and everything, who looks at the basket and says, everything in that cart's better than everything in that one, he's not saying to himself, yeah, I'm a tribal lemming. I don't think for myself. That's what he should say, because it's true. But he's not saying that. Instead, he has deluded himself that I'm being deeply philosophical. I'm sticking to principles. Progressivism is the righteous philosophy, and I follow a righteous philosophy, and all my policies are expressions of that righteous philosophy. And everything in that cart is bad, and anyone who buys that cart is an evil person. That is what we're trying to get away from. Same way we would want a spectrum in medicine, Same way we wouldn't want delusions about grocery carts in shopping is for the same reasons we shouldn't have these delusions here. All right, now, there's also a lot of studies that show the extreme cognitive and moral damage that this model does. Let's start with the cognitive damage. Philip Tetlock has done a lot of research. The best test of cognitive accuracy is prediction. That's how science works, right? You make a prediction, you falsify, you corroborate. And he's found that people who are talking about social issues are much less accurate in their predictions the more they think in terms of the left-right spectrum. So the people who say we need a left-right spectrum, it helps us think, it's a tool of thinking, they're totally wrong. There's no evidence for that. All of the evidence suggests that as soon as we bring a spectrum into the discussion, our brains shut down. That the blood goes from our prefrontal cortex into the lizard brain. It goes to the more primitive parts. And the emotions take over, and our rationality shuts down. And so people who think in terms of left and right don't predict as accurately. It also causes a lot of confusion. It makes us dogmatic. We're not likely to change our mind. We've convinced ourselves that everything in this basket is righteous. And so when we look at everything in that basket, instead of saying, you know, there might be something to it. No, there can't be, because everything in that basket is evil. That's what we're doing to ourselves. It closes our minds. It confuses us. Think about this. My colleagues in history are the worst at this, right? They say Adolf Hitler was on the extreme right. See, there's just one issue. And on that one issue, Adolf Hitler's way out here on the right-hand side. What about the economist Milton Friedman? Oh, yes. He's on the extreme right. They're both out there on the far right. Let's break this down for a minute. Adolf Hitler, a socialist. That's what Nazi means, right? National Socialist. I know people don't like to hear that, but it's true. He believed in nationalizing industry, and he believed in radical redistribution of wealth. That's socialism. Milton Friedman, by contrast, was the greatest champion of free markets in the 20th century. What do they have in common in economic policy? Answer, nothing. Okay? Let's move on to military policy. Hitler was a militarist. Milton Friedman was a pacifist. He opposed every one of America's wars after World War II. Hitler was an anti-Semite, hated Jews. Milton Friedman was a Jew. Okay? Where is the overlap here? Where is the essence connecting Milton Friedman and Adolf Hitler? The answer is it doesn't exist. And we are confusing ourselves. And there are people out there trashing free markets and saying free markets are evil because they're extreme right-wing. And you know who else is right-wing? Adolf Hitler. We can't support free markets because we don't be on the extreme right. Do you see how this model of politics causes incredible damage? How it tarnishes the principles of freedom with guilt by association. Okay? And again, it's not confined to one tribe. You saw it in the 1950s, right? Senator McCarthy. If you believe in free speech, you're a liberal, and liberals are on the left. And we know who else is on the left, don't we? Stalin. So if you believe in free speech, you know who you're like. Joseph Stalin. The principles of free speech were tarnished. So free principles get tarnished by association because of this abominable model of politics. It's time we all stop using it. There's also a great deal of moral damage. It makes people hostile. We talk about the increasing vitriol and anger in our politics, how politics has become much more divisive. It wasn't always that way. But when you look on Ngram Google Viewer and look at the terms left-wing and right-wing, and as they've gone up, partisan hostility has gone up right along with it. It convinces people that those who disagree with you are not just people who think differently or have a few groceries in their basket that maybe you don't like so much. No. They're people who have a fundamentally evil worldview. How can you compromise with people like that? Compromise is not like, hey, we disagree and let's see if we can work together to come up with a mutual solution. No. Compromise is selling out. It's cooperating with Hitler. It's cooperating with Stalin. You've convinced yourself that everything they believe is evil. So how can you cooperate with evil? You can't. It shuts down compromise. It shuts down debate. It turns people arrogant, bigoted, dishonest, and extreme, of course. I mean, if left-wing is good and righteous, then why wouldn't you want to be more righteous by being extreme left-wing and taking all of your policies to the most utter extreme? You would. That makes sense. But if you convince yourself, well, it's a basket of many things, and there is no essence there, then we need to be more cautious. All right. And then, of course, that's where we're going with all this, is because this institution, the Center for the Study of Government and the Individual, is dedicated to promoting classical liberalism, and yet the political spectrum is a tool of illiberalism. People who think in terms of a spectrum are much less likely to engage, they're much less likely to work together, they're much less likely to listen, and worst of all, as we've seen recently, they're much less likely to accept the peaceful transfer of power, which is the essence of democracy. Okay, and then of course you get misinformation historically. We have all been told that the Republican Party has moved to the right and the Democratic Party has moved to the left. Really? Did you know Republicans today are far more in favor of gay marriage than they were 20 years ago? Did you know Republicans today are far more in favor of racial equality than they were 20 years ago? Did you know Republicans today are far more in favor of big government and the welfare state than they were 20 years ago? Where is this move to the right? It doesn't exist. This is a tool of misinformation. It misleads us, it lies to us, it turns us hostile. To put it in simple terms, it makes us stupid and evil. It's time we got rid of it. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Hyrum. Thanks again to the Center for the Study of Government and Individual for having us. Thanks to UCCS for letting me come back and be here on campus. It's great to be here. And thank you to Hyrum for going first to follow the maxim that age goes before beauty. So I just pick up quickly on what Hyrum said there about the myth of polarization, because when I read political science journals or when I'm going to a political science conference, that's the term that I hear all the time, polarization. And you actually hear it in newspapers and in general discourse more generally. It's all over the place. And we think polarization needs to be clarified. What do we mean by polarization? Because it's clear, as Hyrum said, there is more hostility in our politics, there's more anger, there's more divisiveness. But it's not clear that this is a result of a movement to poles of left and right. In fact, as Hyrum just pointed out, the idea that there are even poles of left and right is a myth. But myth dominates the political science discipline. So I wish people come to us and say, okay, you're saying there's this myth of left and right. Is this just a matter of ordinary people need to get more educated and learn from the political science professors? Unfortunately not. Ordinary people are much less likely to believe in the myth of left and right than are social scientists. This is a myth that dominates the academy and universities more broadly. In fact, it was imported into America in the 1930s by academics, by journalists from Russia, right? They reported on the Bolshevik Revolution. They saw that the Bolsheviks used the spectrum of left and right. They said, that's useful, let's use that in America. And it's been corrupting our political discourse for the past century ever since. So this is one of the most common ways that people talk about politics, and this is the most common way that we think about politics in terms of a left-right spectrum. So when we talk about polarization, most people are saying there's a movement by the Democratic Party to the left, and there's a movement by the Republican Party even farther to the right. But as Hyrum said, well, where do we see that? Are Republicans extremely against government spending more than they were 20 or 30 years ago? Not at all. In fact, Donald Trump got the Republican nomination by promising to not reform entitlement spending, and as president kept that promise. Increased government spending drastically under his administration with a Republican Congress. Does this mean that Democrats are now extremely in favor of free speech because that's a liberal principle? Not at all. What we've seen over the last few years is Democrats moving away from their commitment to free speech. So this idea that there's a polarization to polls is simply not true. Now, what evidence do political scientists show for polarization? Well, the most common way, almost everyone who references polarization in political science literature will talk about this statistical application called DW-nominate, which goes through and counts every vote taken by every member of Congress in U.S. history. And they map what they see as the movement of members of Congress, these are the blue and red dots, blue Democrats, red Republicans, to the polls of conservative and liberal. You can see they're conservative up top on the y-axis, liberal on the bottom there on the y-axis. So this is the evidence they show. Well, really, if you dig into what this statistical application does, it's really just saying who votes with who, which reinforces the point that Hyrum made. Liberalism and conservative, it's simply a social group. It's not an enduring philosophy. The issue positions, the attitudes, the values, the principles of left and right are constantly changing. But left and right is simply a social marker. It tells us what tribe you belong to. And so it is true in recent years, Democrats have increasingly voted with Democrats in Congress. Republicans have increasingly voted with Republicans in Congress. But that tells us nothing substantively about what they're voting for. This is probably a little small for you to see, but for example, according to DW-nominate, the Democratic Party here in blue was at its most extremely liberal, right, in the late 19th century. when they were the party of free markets and free trade and less government intervention in the economy, when they were nominating and electing Grover Cleveland to the presidency. And then somehow the most conservative they ever got was like around 1940 when Franklin Roosevelt was president, and drastically increasing taxes, drastically increasing government spending. So if you go back and look at the actual votes they take, what DW Nominate does is they basically just say whatever Democrats vote for is liberal, whatever Republicans vote for is conservative. It's simply a tautology. So if you go back and look at, for example, the 1928 tax increase that was pushed by Herbert Hoover when he was in office. He wanted to raise taxes because that's what Republicans did. This was quoted as as a liberal bill. Raising taxes was liberal, was conservative. And the Democrats who voted against this tax raise, that was considered a liberal vote, to vote against the tax raise. So whatever the parties do is simply tautological. That's what's defined as left and right. So this is not useful for us in talking about left and right. Okay, so what do we mean? What do most people think about when they talk about polarization? Well, the most common definition that we get of liberalism and conservatism is, well, it has to do with change. Liberals want more change, conservatives want the status quo. But of course, this is simply not true. If you go back through and look at the issue positions that Republicans and Democrats take, liberals and conservatives take, it just depends on the issue, right? Liberals want to change some things, they want to keep some things the same. Conservatives want to change some things, and they also want to keep other things the same, right? So if you think about, Ronald Reagan was supposed to be Mr. Conservative in American history. We call his election to the presidency the Republican Revolution, the Reagan Revolution. This was a huge transformation of the way politics was done. He constantly quoted Thomas Paine, that great revolutionary figure of the late 18th century, in favor of the American Revolution. So this idea that Republicans or conservatives always want the status quo and Democrats and liberals always want change is simply not true. What they want to change depends on the issue, and it also depends on the time period, because the basket, as Hyrum talked about, of the issue positions of each party is constantly changing. Okay, so in the book we go through and we talk about two different theories to explain, well, why then do we see these correlations? Why is it that if you go around and talk to people and do survey data, as political scientists do, why do you see that people who are more pro-life on abortion policy were also more likely to be in favor of tax cuts and more opposed to military aid to Ukraine and more opposed to free trade? Right? Why do those issue positions go together? Well, they do so for matters of socialization. And why do we know that's true? Well, there's three ways that we test the two competing hypotheses in our book. We look at the survey data, and if the essentialist theory were true, then we would see that whoever you asked, you go out, take a random sample of the population, these issue positions would correlate. If the socialist theory were true, these issues should only correlate among people who are socialized into left-right thinking. And that's exactly what we find. The constraint, as political scientists call it, of issue positions is overwhelmingly found only among people who are college educated and who have been told that this issue goes with that issue. Most ordinary people in America don't actually have issue constraint in the way that elites do. So it's the constraint that we see in the population is simply a product of socialization. It does not exist in nature. The experimental data is also good. Hyrum mentioned the study by Barber and Pope in 2019, where they actually prompted people by giving a different policy statement based on the tribe that it was associated with, right? Trump said this or that, and they didn't actually have to make up quotes because Trump had taken different positions on about 10 different issues. So it was actually a very honest experiment that they gave to people, and the prime they got completely dictated the positions that these people took based on their self-identity with their particular tribe. And then the historical data we think is also very illuminating here, because the issue positions taken by left and right are constantly evolving. They were very different 20 years ago than what they are today, and I predict that they will be different 20 years from now than they are today. Okay, so this is a bold claim that we're making, that the left-right thinking is misleading and harmful. Fortunately, there are a couple people that have made this point before, we just haven't listened to them. So Michael Oakeshott was a famous British political theorist, and he pointed out exactly what Hyrum said, that ideology does not come first, it comes last. So in his 1951 work on political education, he said, far from a political ideology being the quasi-divine parent of political activity, it turns out to be its earthly stepchild. Political activity comes first, and a political ideology follows after. Ideology is the stories we tell ourselves to justify the issue positions that we take. Raymond Aron is one of the great political theorists of the 20th century, and he lived through a lot of the most vicious fights between left and right in the 20th century. And writing in his memoirs, he again was trying to defend this idea that there is no eternal left, there is no eternal right. They're always changing. He said, I did not deny the fact that there was a distinction between the right and the left in the National Assembly. This is where the terms first emerged in the 1780s during the French Revolution, the National Assembly of France. What I denied was that there was an eternal left, the same in various historical circumstances, inspired by the same values, united in the same aspirations. Okay, so one of the reasons that left-right is not useful for us and is actually harmful is because it is anachronistic. As mentioned, it was created in France at the time of the French Revolution. Those who sat on the left-hand side of the speaker were more in favor of the revolution. Those who sat on the right-hand side of the speaker in the French Assembly were more opposed to the revolution. But that was one issue. And now we're talking about a lot of other issues, and we're not talking about the French Revolution anymore. We're talking about military aid to Ukraine. We're talking about COVID pandemic policy. We're talking about taxes. We're talking about same-sex marriage. We're talking about the war in Iraq. There's hundreds of issues that we're talking about, and there's not just one issue. Unfortunately, this way of thinking was revived by Russian revolutionaries, by Bolsheviks in the 1910s, and has come to America in the 1920s and 30s, and unfortunately, America has exported this model around the world to the detriment of those places that have adopted it. This is something that Republicans, Democrats, politicians used to understand, that the left-right spectrum was harmful. Ronald Reagan famously in his 1964 speech endorsing Barry Goldwater for the Republican election in 1964 said, you and I are told increasingly we have to choose between a left or right. Well, I'd like to suggest there is no such thing as a left or right. That's what we're suggesting today. There is no such thing. There's only an up or down. Up to man's old age dream, the ultimate in individual freedom consistent with law and order, or down to the ant-heap of totalitarianism. Right? So there can be principles of freedom, there can be principles of totalitarianism, but these are diverse and they do not map on neatly to left and right. And I don't have time to go through this today because I want to save time for question and answer, but we can go through and look on any issue you can choose. The two groups who call themselves left and right, which is synonymous in American politics with Democrat, Republican, have changed their issue position. Whether it's abortion, whether it's civil rights, whether it's war, whether it's same-sex marriage, whether it's vaccines, they have changed positions at one point or another in American history. There is no essence to these different groups, left and right. So I'm happy to come back to this in the Q&A, but I won't go through all of it right now. Okay, so what typically happens is when we point out that there is no consistency in these two groups on the issue of change, that's the most common one that's given, that the left is in favor of change, the right is against change. People will often come up to us with other essences. So they say, well, you missed the real essence is, conservatives love America and liberals hate America, right? Or, liberals love poor people and conservatives hate poor people, right? But these are typically self-serving distinctions or essences that they propose between the two groups. We're happy to come back to this, but we kind of go through in the book why none of these different approaches fail. Okay, so if the left-right spectrum is not useful, and if it is misleading, why does it persist? It's been around since the late 18th century. Well, unfortunately, there's lots of false models that have persisted for centuries in human history, right? The geocentric theory of the universe persisted for a long time before people realized, actually, the Earth revolves around the sun, not the other way around. The four humors model of medicine persisted for centuries before medical doctors realized, you know what, that's actually a completely false way of understanding the human body and human health. But there is this idea that simplicity is appealing to human beings. Thomas Reid pointed this out when he said that there is a disposition in human nature to reduce things to as few as possible. This love of simplicity and of reducing things to few principles have produced many a false system. We believe the left-right spectrum is one of those simplistic systems. A second reason that we believe the left-right spectrum persists is because it allows people to disguise their tribalism. Most people want to think of themselves as principled, rational philosophers. They don't want to admit that they're just simply going along with what their tribe is doing or with what their party is doing. And so they use their rationality to justify their tribal behavior. And James Madison identified this tendency in human behavior, writing as Publius in the Federalist Papers, when he said, "As long as the reason of man continues fallible and he is at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed. As long as the connection subsists between his reason and his self-love, his opinions and his passions will have a reciprocal influence on each other." So one of the reasons we believe that the left-right spectrum is so dominant in the academy and among universities is because professors are really good at coming up with stories to justify the positions that they take, right? And the more intellectual capacity you have to tell yourself stories, the more you are able to cling to a false spectrum. Okay, so we think that's the second reason. A third reason is that the parties have incentives to promote this left-right spectrum, as Hyrum was talking about. By the way, can anyone tell me who they see in this picture? Yeah, the Sultan of Swat there, in a nice V-neck sweater. Who is he standing next to? Anyone know? Yeah, Al Smith, a forgotten figure from American history, but the Democratic Party's presidential candidate in the 1928 election. And Al Smith was incensed that Franklin Roosevelt had betrayed what he saw as the principles of liberalism. As Hyrum said, liberalism, once upon a time, meant individual freedom, limited government, less government intervention in the economy. And FDR campaigned as a liberal. He got elected, saying he was going to reduce spending and reduce deficits, and he did the opposite once in office. He increased spending, he increased deficits. And a lot of Democrats like Smith were incensed that he betrayed their principles, and so he said, "It's all right with me if they," meaning the New Dealers, FDR and his gang, "want to disguise themselves as Norman Thomas, the socialist presidential candidate, or Karl Marx, or Lenin, or any of the rest of that bunch, but what I won't stand for is to let them march under the banner of Jefferson, Jackson, or Cleveland." Right? Democratic Party traditionally been in favor of limited government. But Smith was the exception. Most people just went along. Most Democrats, most people who called themselves liberals just went along with FDR's redefinition of liberalism, his transformation of the Democratic Party. They wanted to say, well, this new stuff, it's also liberalism. And that's what liberalism really is more government intervention in the economy and taxing and redistributing wealth and regulating corporations. That's what true liberalism is. So they completely changed their issue positions, but they justified it as, well, it's all liberalism because it's all what the Democratic Party does. And so parties have an incentive to prop up this left-right spectrum because it justifies their changes in public policy. Okay, I won't go into this too much because I'm getting to the end of my time, but as Hyrum said, there's a variety of harms, intellectual harms that come along with the left-right spectrum. It really does make people, not that everyone who thinks in terms of left and right is stupid or bad, it's that they would be smarter and more charitable and kinder if they didn't use the left-right spectrum. The studies are pretty clear here that people are limiting their cognitive ability and they're limiting their ability to be a generous human being when they use this framework of left and right. And so we're worried that this not only produces intellectual harm, but it also produces moral harm, it produces prejudice and bigotry, just as racism allows people to hate other people based on their skin color, right? We believe that ideologism allows people to hate or excuse hate because they have a different ideological grouping. And as political scientists talk about polarization, they distinguish between ideological polarization and affective polarization. Ideological polarization, as I hope we've shown today, is a myth. That there are no poles, ideological poles, to which the two parties are moving. Affective polarization just refers to the increasing hatred or hostility between two groups in society, namely Republicans and Democrats. And so we think that the myth of ideological polarization is actually promoting the reality of affective polarization, that it's causing people to hate and to justify the hatred they have for other groups. Because, well, that person isn't just wrong about a few things in the other political party, they're wrong about everything. Because every issue position they have flows out of a bad or evil philosophy. And the data is pretty clear here. This is from the Pew Center. They survey Americans. What are your views if you're a Democrat about the Republican Party? What are your views if you're a Republican about the Democratic Party? Starting in the mid-90s up until today, you can see how these feelings have become more and more unfavorable as people think in terms of left and right more and more. Okay, so for our purposes today, we think that this also has tremendous political harm. We're concerned about this country. We are worried that people who think in terms of left and right are more willing to undermine the Constitution and its principles, like the rule of law, like separation of powers, like federalism, because they can justify undermining those principles by saying, well, the other side is so bad that it's okay if we don't have federalism, or it's okay if we concentrate power in the executive, or it's okay if we allow presidents to trample the rule of law, because that other party is so bad that we have to justify anything that our side does. And we're worried that this undermines pluralism, that people cannot allow for dissenting viewpoints to exist in the same country. We see more and more people in this country talking about civil war, about seceding from the Union, about saying, I can't live in the same country with this other political party because they use this dualistic way of thinking. And this promotes authoritarianism and populism. Okay, so how can we fix this? Well, in the book we talk about 5 different ways that we can improve our politics. One is to recognize the myth of left and right, to realize that there is no left-right political spectrum. And secondly, as Hyrum said, to go granular. Instead of saying, well, that person is a right-wing pro-lifer, or that person is a left-wing government spender. Just say, oh, they want to increase government spending on these social programs. Oh, that person believes in more government restrictions on abortion. You can use that language, go granular, without using the pejorative slurs of left and right. So we need to change our speech. We need to use labels that imply truth rather than false things. So instead of saying conservatives and liberals, we can talk about Republicans and Democrats. Republican and Democrat imply something true, that people belong to social groups, political parties, that have a basket of issue positions. Conservative and liberal implies something false. It implies that there is a coherent, enduring, transcendent philosophy that binds together, by nature, all of the issue positions in the baskets of the two tribes. Fourth, we suggest people find healthier tribes. Right? So human beings are, by nature, social animals. They need to exist in social groups. We need that as human beings. Where do we find our identity? Where do we find our meaning? We suggest there's healthier outlets than ideological tribes, right? There's service organizations, there's churches, there's local fraternities, there's organizations where you can meet together and have social interaction with your neighbors in a unified cause. But when it's an ideological tribe, your social interactions are guided by a false understanding of reality, which we think leads to bad outcomes. And then finally, we encourage people to engage in adversarial collaboration. To be a rational person means to think about the arguments from a different side and consider them, and to work with people who might have other ideas, and then test, right? And both agree what are the parameters that we're going to accept for the conclusions that we come to. And engage in a good faith, rational discourse, and accept the conclusions or the outcomes of the studies or the experiments that you engage in, rather than simply inhabiting media echo chambers where you just get told the same thing over and over that tells you that you are right. Okay, so we're hopeful that this can be useful for citizens more generally as we promote a free, flourishing, and prosperous society. We think that the economic, political, and social foundations, that the American constitutional order will promote those things, but we're concerned that the left-right spectrum is a false intellectual framework that is undermining those things. So I'll end there and I'll open it up to question and answer. Thank you.
Yes, we do have 10, maybe 15 minutes for questions. So I'll let the Lewises pick on you. Just make sure you project so everyone can hear you.
Okay, sounds good. How about right here? I saw your hand first.
Yes, I'm Leslie. I'm actually a poli-sci philosophy major here. My question is, what do you suggest we do with this info as voters or potential leaders, and how does this affect potential future political, realignment changes?
Yeah. Hyrum, you want to take this one?
Well, I hope you implied it. Again, I would say do what you do when you go grocery shopping, right? I mean, if they had two baskets there, you would just pick the best one of the two. And you talk about realignments, yeah, that happens. Things move from basket to basket. Things the Republicans believe today, Democrats believe 10 years ago, 20 years ago, whatever. And so as those switch baskets, change the basket you believe that you purchased. That's how I would approach it. But we can't emphasize enough the necessity of going granular. Instead of talking of a spectrum, talk about particular issues. You want to talk about abortion, talk about abortion. Don't say, well, you're right-wing, you're like Hitler. Say you believe in abortion restriction. Right-wing like Hitler communicates something false. Believe in restricting abortion, that communicates something true. So accuracy, that makes for a better citizenry, that makes for a better polity, in my view. I hope that's helpful to you.
Okay, yeah, right here. I think I saw your hand next.
Yeah, and my name is Brad Harvey. I just know a couple of people in the room. My question really gets down to your theory about the myth of left and right, and how or what your opinion is about executive orders, and have they helped or hindered that clarification. I mean, I'm more of a constitutionalist. I think personally executive orders push the rule of law, but we're seeing presidents getting sworn in, and the first thing they do is issue a whole bunch of executive orders, rescinding the prior executive orders and pushing new ones. I mean, I'm just curious as to your opinion as to that effect and what we can do about it.
Yeah, so I think executive orders are a good example of the hypocrisy that left-right thinking promotes. Because when you belong to an ideological tribe, you want to justify everything that your tribe does and criticize everything that the other tribe does. Now, if you didn't think in terms of left and right, and you just thought in terms of baskets, you could say, hey, I like this particular thing, I'm a constitutionalist, I don't like executive orders, and I don't like it whichever basket it's in. But if you have left-right thinking, you like it when it's in your basket, and you don't like it when it's in the other basket, so that leads to hypocrisy. And of course, we've seen this tremendously, right? Barack Obama, when he was campaigning for the presidency in 2008, was very critical of George W. Bush and unilateral executive power and the unitary theory of the executive, and promised that he was going to rein in executive power. And members of Team Blue, Democrats, are very excited. Oh yeah, the imperial presidency, we've got to rein in the executive power. Then what did Obama do when he came into office? He did exactly what Bush had done, started using unilateral executive power, started writing executive orders, and all of a sudden Democrats were no longer critical of executive orders. They now said it was good and important. Likewise, in 2016, Donald Trump was very critical of Obama. He said, oh, Obama, he just uses executive orders because he can't get anything done in Congress. I don't want to do that. And then 100 days into his presidency, his press office releases a press release bragging that he had used more executive orders than any president since Harry Truman. And of course, members of Team Red said, oh, this is great. They were critical when Obama did it, but they like it. So it makes us hypocrites, the left-right political spectrum. I think executive orders is a good example of that.
And maybe I can just jump in there. So I completely agree with you. We would both consider ourselves constitutionalists too. And precisely the reason we're constitutionalists, and precisely the reason the founding fathers were constitutionalists, is because they believed in human fallibility, right? I mean, it was a realist-based approach to politics, that nobody's infallible, human beings are corruptible, and therefore we need checks, balances, constitutional restraints on human behavior in order to prevent that. What the left-right spectrum is, it breaks that all down. It says, no, humans aren't fallible. Those people over there are, but not me. I'm in the good guy tribe. Therefore, we don't need restraints, because as long as we're doing my things, this basket is so good and so wonderful, and everything in this is good. So pursuing this is all that matters. So it puts procedure aside, right? for outcome. It assumes the outcomes are infallible, therefore we can throw all procedures out. So the left-right spectrum is devastating to constitutionalism. And we're constitutionalists no matter who's in office. We don't care whether they consider themselves left-wing, right-wing, up, down, whatever, green, blue. We don't care. We believe in constitutional restraints, and we are consistent on that. And so to get back to your question of how to be a better citizen, yes, be consistent. Check your tribalism. Say, I don't care who's doing it, I stand for principles, instead of following what a certain tribe does and then after the fact making up stories to say, no, I've always believed that, because that's, of course, what these people are doing in terms of neighborhoods. So constitutionalism requires that we get rid of this. If you believe in constitutionalism, I don't think you can.
Isn't that a tribe?
I'm sorry?
Isn't that a tribe? Being a constitutionalist?
We wish.
We'll start with that. You should get shirts.
We wish too.
Yeah. So could there be a tribe based on principle? Yes, but the two political tribes we have today are not. So again, we're not necessarily against tribes, we're just against the kind of tribes that exist currently.
Yeah, and just to go back, I think it was point 4, we need to find healthier tribes. So if you find a constitutionalist tribe, sign up. But those aren't our two parties right now. Yeah, Charles, I'd love to hear what you think.
Are there structural reasons for why contemporary, or I guess post-New Deal parties in America are incentivized to keep this myth going, whereas the 19th century and early 20th century parties, as you show in your other research, Verlin, basically had no pretenses to being philosophically coherent. They're like, look, our goals are to reward party-faithful people with patronage, federal jobs, and bring home the bacon to our constituents, right? And there really wasn't much of a pretense beyond that. They happened to, sort of align on certain issues, but there wasn't this thing. Was it the structure of the old-style parties, maybe pre-modern civil service, that made them resistant to this kind of thing, whereas, because the only other sort of exogenous factor I can think of is the rise of this way of thinking corresponds with the idea of a professionalized administrative state, which is sort of the era the progressives was imposed during the New Deal. I don't know, just any thoughts you might have on that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I don't know the exact answer to that, but I have a couple things I might share with that. So I think you're right. In the 19th century, parties were typically, although I don't think always, less about philosophies or coherent ideologies that would bind together their issue positions, right? So Abraham Lincoln was opposed to the expansion of slavery to the Western territories. He was in favor of a higher tariff on import taxes, right? And he didn't have to come up with some philosophy that says, well, this is why that thing goes with that thing. It's just these are the two things in my basket that I care about, and that's what our party's about. Now, I think there were times where there was attempts to create more philosophical coherence on the parties. If you think back to maybe the debates between the Federalists and the Republicans, between Adams and Jefferson, if you read some of those texts, there is claims by people like Jefferson, Madison, his followers that said, well, we have these issue positions because they're all in favor of republicanism, right? Which is we're opposed to monarchical authority. That's why we want the states and the localities to have more power than the national government. And within the national government, that's why we want Congress to have more power rather than the presidency. And those two things are connected by our Republican philosophy. And so I think there were people who were motivated by philosophy, and I think there are people today who are motivated by philosophy. But in the 19th century, there was no left-right spectrum. No one ever said, if they ever talked about left-wing or right-wing, they were talking about architecture or military formations or sports teams, but they never were talking about politics. But what you did see in the 19th century is the rise and fall of parties more often. Because if a party evolved, as parties always do, from the issue positions that someone cared about, because they were driven by a philosophy that bound together certain issue positions, then they would start a new party. They wouldn't delude themselves and say, well, whatever my party's doing is left or right, and therefore I'm going to go along with these changes. But as soon as you have the left-right spectrum imported in the 1920s, we have never had a change in the two major parties. In the 19th century, you had Federalists, Republicans, Whigs, Democratic Republicans, National Republicans, always changing. But now we don't have that anymore, and I think the left-right spectrum is the reason for that.
And maybe I could chime in on this. I think the best answer that we would give, our best thesis, we cover in our book is, I think the New Deal probably did it. The New Deal so dominated political discourse in the 1930s that basically every other issue was pushed to the margins. So the left-right spectrum took hold because it worked briefly. There was a bright shining moment for about 15 years when it worked, because there was just one issue, at least in national politics. When you called somebody a liberal, it meant one thing. They were in favor of the New Deal. That's it. They could be the most virulent racist in the world, and they were still considered a liberal and unfree. It's true. Go back and read the record. In fact, liberals were more likely to be racist than conservatives back then. Okay? So, or abortion. What was your stance on abortion? You didn't talk about it. There was one issue on the national stage. So it worked to model. If you really, really, really wanted more government, that was far left. If you really, really, really wanted less government, that was far right. And then, people in the middle. So the New Deal made this political spectrum so attractive because it worked. And so everybody adopted it to describe, how much in favor or against the government spending you are. The problem is, within 15 years, it totally broken down, because then we had the question of military intervention versus isolationism, we had, McCarthyism and loyalty oaths, and we had civil rights, and, abortion, gay marriage. All these other issues came online, and so politics became multidimensional, but we kept the unidimensional spectrum. And instead of saying, all right, politics is about a lot of issues now, we can't use that spectrum anymore, people said, no, it's still about one issue. And abortion, and tax cuts, and size of government, everything else is all part of one big thing, and they started the storytelling. So I think that's our best answer. And why do the parties love it? The parties love it because I want you to imagine you get a fundraising letter from the Democratic Party, and it says to you, Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so, we hope you will donate to the Democratic Party. Our party stands for a bunch of things, some of them good, some of them bad, please donate. That's the truth. But now I want you to imagine you get a letter, Mrs. So-and-so, we stand for liberalism and progressivism. Everything our party believes is good, everything their party believes is bad. America is going to end if you don't donate money. That's more likely to get you money. That's more likely to raise funds. The parties have every incentive to perpetuate the myth of left and right. The myth of left and right is so good for their power, so good for their pocketbook, so good for their institutional structure. It keeps people loyal. They can betray every principle they have, but as long as they perpetuate the myth that they're progressive, they will keep people loyal no matter what they're doing.
Is that because national party ID has more cachet than just the performance of individual office holders? Like in the past, it might have been, vote for Sam Rayburn, he got you electricity in your rural district in Texas. It's not so much that he's a Democrat, that he's on the left. It's that he does good things for the district, but now it's party ID matters more, and so people think, well, you have to vote based on the spectrum.
That sounds right.
Yeah, I think that's right. As the left-right spectrum has become more entrenched in our political discourse, politics has become much more nationalized. And I don't think that's a coincidence for sure. Okay, yeah, over here, in the far end.
Well, you kind of just talked about it, but I was wondering if your book really provides for that discussion of those that precipitate the myth out of ignorance, which I think is most ordinary people, and those that precipitate it out of bad faith because it fits their agenda. I think with what you said about how we can change the way that it continues to be a topic in our discourse, I think it definitely works on a smaller level, but I was wondering if you think that there are structural, that it is so entrenched in the political structure of our country in any way that would make it actually difficult for it to be changed on a larger scale rather than a smaller scale.
Great question. Yeah, we were actually, we just saw a book review written today, which was in agreement with a lot of what we were saying in the book, but basically ended by saying, well, this is a fool's errand that they're on. And they're probably right about that. And that's something that we understand, that you're fighting against linguistic frameworks, and it's really hard to overthrow linguistic frameworks. I mean, how long did the four humors of theory of medicine dominate society? For centuries. And it's really hard for people to change the way they think and to change the way they talk. So I guess we're not super optimistic on that, but we think it's worth fighting the good fight. And we do distinguish between people who do this for bad faith reasons and people who do it just because that's what they've been socialized into doing. We think that's an important distinction, right? So it's very good for Democratic Party politicians, Republican Party politicians to talk this way because it helps them get reelected. It's very good for MSNBC and Fox News to talk this way because it drives ratings and gets people really angry. And, yeah, I want to turn on and hear why everything my party thinks is right and why everything the other party thinks is wrong, and that's great for ratings. But it's not good for democracy, and it's not good for keeping this country together. Unfortunately or fortunately, we do live in a democracy, and so in order to get politicians to change the way they talk about politics and to give up the left-right spectrum, it's going to have to come from ordinary people. It's going to have to come from voters. They have to have a reason to change the way they talk, and they're only going to do that if voters are going to start supporting candidates who eschew that framework. And so it's going to have to be a grassroots thing, unfortunately, or fortunately, however you view that. So we do hope that you will go out and share this message if you think it's compelling, and we would love to see a groundswell movement, but we recognize that we are up against something that's going to be very difficult. Yeah.
I will do time for one more question.
Okay, let's see, maybe you're a student there in the back? Can I call on you? Okay.
So have you noticed any correlation between the changes in left and right in like 4-year or 2-year election cycles?
4-year and 2-year?
Elections, yeah. Have any correlation between when the left and right changes began the election cycle?
He wrote a whole book on that. Yeah.
Yeah, so we do notice that when parties come into control of government, they tend to want to use the powers at their disposal. This is another James Madison quote I can show you. But that is human nature, that human beings like to exercise power. And they want to expand the power of the institutions that they control. So typically when a party or ideological tribe is out of power, they tend to be critical of government power. So if they don't control the presidency, they tend to be more critical of presidential power, particularly foreign intervention, because that's something the presidents control. If they don't control Congress and the presidency, if they're out of both, then they tend to criticize more national government power, particularly more government intervention in the economy and society, because they don't control that. But what funny thing happens is once they get elected and come into office, they start acting against all the things they campaigned on, right? So they in the campaign say, yeah, I'm going to cut spending, and I'm going to stop the foreign wars, I'm going to stop the executive orders, and then they get into office and they increase spending, and they increase the wars, and they increase the executive orders, and their co-partisans now start changing their positions to justify what the party in power is doing. And so we have found there's lots of reasons party ideologies evolve. There's other social reasons. There's historical contingencies, right? There's wars that get thrust upon the country, or there's recessions that get thrust upon the country. So there are external factors that cause changes. But if you're looking for consistent patterns, we have found that changes in control of government shape party ideology change. Yeah.
And he's going to make me summarize this book for him. It's particularly pronounced when it comes to foreign policy. So what Verlin found in his book was anytime a party had long control of the presidency, the entire rhetoric of that party would flip-flop on foreign policy. So if you had the presidency for 8 years, your party suddenly became the hawkish party. And you started calling hawkishness liberal, if you're doing that. And then the Republicans get party for 8 years, and now suddenly the Republicans become the high. And the entire apparatus, right, the media, the press releases, everything becomes pro-war when you have long-term control. And the other party says, no, warmonger, so position, we say, all through the Iraq War, George W. Bush is the most right-wing president of all times. Really? What's he doing that's so right-wing? I mean, he's expanding government like crazy. He wants to give amnesty to all undocumented immigrants. What's right-wing? Well, that war is so right-wing, But now Donald Trump repudiated the Iraq War. Are people saying, well, gee, the Republican Party moved to the left? No, they moved even further to the right. Repudiating the Iraq War is suddenly now extreme right-wing. You see how we just redefine the terms, and that is particularly pronounced with foreign policy. Anyway.
Is that both the myth of left and right, or you remember?
Yeah, Ideas of Power is the other one about party control. Yeah.
I think that's a good time to stop. Please join me in welcoming.